Okay.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Madison Thomas, and along with my partner Alethea, we're going to go ahead and prove to you that the death penalty should stay active and refute the claims made by our opponents. In the beginning of his claim, my opponent argued that life without parole is a better option than the death penalty. So according to aclunc.org, no one sentenced to life without parole has ever been released on parole in California or in any other state. This proves that they will die in prison along with the death penalty. My opponent then goes on to argue about the cost of the death penalty. According to statistics provided by the Office of California's Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst, the current annual cost for maintaining an inmate in a state prison is $47,102. The actual cost of the lethal injection is $1,286.86 each. That's about $38,000 different. The problem is the appeal process, not exactly the death penalty alone. That's not what's taking up the money. It's the amount of appeals that are awarded to these inmates that are on death row. The actual process of executing a prisoner on death row is not taking up all of our money. And the actual execution costs nothing. Texas pays an average of $83 for the lethal execution. My opponent then goes on to talk about the race issue of the death penalty. He argues that African Americans have a harder time with their sentencing. Actually, the race of the defendants executed matches up with the race of serial killers. White people are executed 56% of the time, and serial killers are white most of the time. It then goes to the race of the victim in the death penalty case. White people are the victims 76% of the time according to death penalty statistics, statisticbreak.com. This means that although yes, when it is a white person that is being sentenced, and yes, it might be a black person that was the victim, they get sentenced to death penalty less. That's strictly because there are less of these cases. There's much higher percentage of white on white crime, which means like obviously there's going to be more occurrence that they would be executed in that situation. My opponent then goes on to argue about the fact that the death penalty is not the same across the board. That's because the federal death penalty, they don't have the option to enact it for the states. They cannot force a state to make it. Each state is responsible for how they choose to sentence their prisoners. So the state of Arizona Office of Attorney General says that the death penalty may only be imposed for first degree or premeditated or felony murder. So in Arizona, they have a strategy. They know what they're going to do if something. They know that if someone has a death penalty, what crime they've committed. The federal death penalty has not been used from 1964 to 2000, but it's been used once in 2003. That's the reason there's not the same across the board, because it's rarely ever used, and the federal death penalty is dealing with its own cases, dealing with own people that are on federal death row. And like I said before, the federal government is constitutionally barred from acquiring the services of the states and applying the federal criminal law, according to deathpenaltyworldwide.org. My opponent then goes on to argue that the death penalty does not deter crime. The main reason that there are statistics that slightly sway to this way is that the capital punishment is too infrequent to have a measurable effect on the crime drop. Like I said, with the process of how much it costs, the appeals are the main reason. The amount of appeals that drags on the death row process to where most prisoners end up dying in prison and are not actually executed. So prisoners, yes, they may be sentenced to death, but it's very unlikely that they would actually die by lethal injection. However, just according to Slate.com, America has become significantly safer over the past 2 decades, with today's violent crime rate nearly half of what it was at the start of the 1990s. And USnews.com says a comprehensive review of capital punishment, research since 1975 by Drexel University economist Bijou Yang and psychologist David Lester, concluded that the majority of studies that track effects over many years and across states or counties find a deterrent effect. So there is a decent amount of arguments that say it does deter crime. However, those that say it does not, it could be backed up by the fact that it just happens too infrequently for any prisoner to necessarily feel the actual threat of being executed, because they can exhaust so many appeal options, and depending on their age, it's very likely that they could die in prison. My opponent then goes on to talk about the fact that innocent people will be sentenced to death row and possibly executed. The innocent rate on death row is approximated at 4.1%. This is just the amount of people that get sentenced to die. This is not the amount of people that they assume are innocent that have died by death row. This is just the possibility that they may be executed, but this doesn't actually happen. It's very possible that through their appeal process, they could come out and realize that they are innocent, or at the time that they're waiting to actually be executed, new evidence could come out. This is not saying 4.1% are executed. 4.1% of possible innocent people are sentenced. My opponent, last but not least, argues that the death penalty is not moral. However, all the heinous crimes that the people that are sentenced to the death penalty commit are not moral either. According to deathpenalty.procon.org, an argument is an eye for an eye, honors that the victim. Honors the victim helps console grieving families, and perpetrators of heinous crimes never have an opportunity to cause future tragedy. There's plenty of instances where children are murdered and the mother or the father didn't believe in the death penalty before, but one mother said that when it happens to your own child you give birth to, it makes up your mind for you. And when it happens in a personal situation, you're going to want the death